Most Americans knew Johnny Carson as the man who owned late-night television. For 30 years, he walked onto that Tonight Show stage with the confidence of a king, the timing of a master craftsman, and the warmth of someone who felt like part of the family. Night after night, he made us laugh. Year after year, he made NBC millions. And by the time he retired, Carson himself had amassed a personal fortune estimated at more than $300 million. An astonishing figure for a talk show host in that era. But what most fans never knew was that the real story of Johnny Carson's money, where it went, who ultimately received it, and why almost none of it was visible after he passed away, became one of Hollywood's quietest and most carefully protected mysteries. And to understand why Carson's fortune seems to disappear, you have to understand the man behind the curtain and the secrets he spent a lifetime protecting. You remember Johnny Carson, the easy grin, the perfectly raised eyebrow, the way he could make America laugh simply by standing still and letting the joke land. For 30 years, Carson didn't just host The Tonight Show, he defined it. By the 1980s, he was earning a salary unheard of for television personalities. NBC executives, according to one former producer who worked closely with Carson, considered him the most valuable man on television. And they weren't exaggerating. His contract eventually ballooned to a reported $25 million a year, plus profit participation. Millions tuned in nightly. Movie stars prayed to be booked. Politicians begged for airtime. And behind the scenes, Carson was building an empire. Investments, production companies, real estate, and an increasingly powerful control over his intellectual property. Yet the irony, as multiple producers later admitted, is that Carson never trusted money. Not really. It made him nervous. It made him careful. It made him secretive. A Tonight Show staffer who was there from the 1970s through Carson's final show said, "Johnny always felt like everything could vanish. He grew up during the Depression. Those scars never left him." And it's this tension, the most recognizable, financially secure man in late-night television quietly behaving as if his future was fragile, that sets the stage for the mystery. Because by the time Johnny Carson died in 2005 at the age of 79, something strange happened, something unexpected, something almost no one predicted. His massive fortune, the wealth he spent decades protecting, did not stay in the places people assumed. In fact, only a tiny portion became public record. The rest, it seemed to evaporate. But as you'll soon see, nothing about Johnny Carson ever just happened. His financial disappearance was intentional, the result of years of planning, decades of secrecy, and decisions rooted in emotional wounds very few people ever saw. To understand what happened to Carson's money, you first have to understand the man's relationship with money itself. Johnny Carson grew up in Iowa during the Great Depression, in a home where financial security was an illusion. According to one longtime friend, Johnny never forgot what it felt like to hear his parents whispering about bills. That stayed with him. Money wasn't comfort, money wasn't luxury, money was survival. Even after he became the most successful late-night host in history, Carson lived with the nagging fear that it could all disappear. This fear fueled his meticulous, sometimes obsessive, approach to protecting his wealth. A business associate from the 1980s recalled, "Johnny didn't like risk. He didn't trust Wall Street. He didn't trust bankers. He trusted about 3 people in his entire financial life." Among those 3 people was his attorney and longtime advisor, the man who would ultimately shape the destiny of Carson's estate, Alan P., a full name rarely used publicly due to the secrecy surrounding Carson's trusts. Carson's distrust of money wasn't irrational. He had lived through some of the most financially painful episodes a public figure can face: huge divorce settlements, expensive legal battles, a high-profile IRS dispute, ownership fights with NBC. This combination hardened him. It taught him that money, though plentiful, was something that could be taken away at any moment. And so Carson developed financial habits that seemed odd to outsiders. He saved compulsively. He used trusts aggressively. He refused to let accountants or attorneys discuss his finances with others. Even his closest friends admitted they had no idea how much he truly had. One Tonight Show writer put it simply, "Johnny guarded his money the way other people guard their families." Which is exactly where the mystery begins. Because Carson's need for privacy didn't end when he left the Tonight Show stage in 1992. It intensified. Behind closed doors, he began designing what insiders call the most airtight estate plan Hollywood has ever seen. And that plan is the reason his $300 million fortune seems to have vanished. But before we get there, we need to talk about the forces that changed everything. His divorces, his lawsuits, and the quiet battles that drained millions long before he started giving it away. According to an estate attorney who later reviewed portions of Carson's planning documents, Johnny Carson did not want a public probate. He didn't want headlines. He didn't want fights. He wanted invisibility. To accomplish this, he relied heavily on one man, his attorney and financial architect. This advisor urged Carson to do something most celebrities never consider: move nearly everything into revocable and irrevocable trusts years before his death. You need to know what that means because it's key to the mystery. Trust assets do not go through public probate. Trust beneficiaries are never publicly disclosed. Trust values never become public record. In other words, everything inside these trusts becomes legally invisible. And Carson loved invisibility. Multiple colleagues have said he treated privacy like oxygen. Even in retirement, when he settled into a quiet life in Malibu, Carson kept his finances sealed off from everyone except a handful of trusted experts. According to one advisor quoted in later legal filings, Johnny's estate plan was built so that, outside of 2 or 3 people, nobody would ever know where the money went. This is why, in the first days after his death in 2005, news outlets scrambled. Reporters kept asking, how much did Carson leave behind? Where did it go? Why is there no public will? The answer was simple. He did not leave a traditional will. He left trusts, layers of them, each one protected by strict confidentiality. And this secrecy is what sets up the next part of the story. The people who took the biggest slices of his fortune weren't ex-wives. They weren't his sons. They weren't Hollywood. They were someone else entirely. But to understand that, we have to talk about the financial wounds that shaped his decisions. Johnny Carson was married 4 times, and each marriage left a financial scar. According to a Tonight Show staffer who witnessed Carson's personal struggles during the 1970s and 1980s, Johnny could command a room of millions, but when it came to relationships, he was fragile. His divorces were not only emotionally costly, they were financially devastating. The most infamous was his split from Joanna Holland in 1985. Her settlement became one of the largest in Hollywood at the time, a number so staggering that insiders still debate the exact total. Some say she walked away with $20 million. Others insist the figure was far higher. One NBC executive recalled, "When Johnny talked about that divorce, he didn't mention the marriage. He mentioned the number. And remember, this wasn't his only divorce." Earlier separations also involved expensive alimony, property division, and long-term commitments. Carson once famously joked on air, "My last divorce was amicable, in that she got the house, the cars, and the furniture." Behind the humor was real pain. His friends said he felt embarrassed, like his private failures had become public entertainment. Emotionally, the divorces made him guarded. Financially, they reshaped the future of his estate. After the final divorce, Carson became determined to prevent anyone, from controlling his money again. That meant no more joint accounts, tight financial control, a stronger reliance on trusts, preparing long-term philanthropic plans that could not be altered. One insider described the shift as Johnny's financial lockdown. But the divorces were only the beginning. Soon, Carson would face something far more stressful, a battle with the IRS that shook his confidence in the very system meant to protect him. And that fight would push him even deeper into secrecy. Carson's private financial turmoil intensified in the late 1970s and early 1980s when he entered a high-stakes fight with the IRS. According to a former NBC executive, the dispute centered around income classification. What was salary, what was performance income, and what qualified as business expenses. It sounds technical, but for Carson, it was deeply personal. The IRS wanted millions. Carson refused. The fight dragged on for years. A business manager later said Johnny felt persecuted. He believed he was being targeted because of his fame. Legal fees skyrocketed, stress mounted. At times, Carson seemed genuinely worn down by it all. And this wasn't the only battle. He also clashed with NBC over Tonight Show ownership and syndication rights. He eventually won more control, but not without incurring significant costs. By the time these conflicts settled, insiders estimate Carson spent tens of millions on legal fees, settlements, and negotiations. For a man who already distrusted institutions, these experiences were confirmation. Money could be seized. Money could be drained. Money could be lost. And so he doubled down on financial secrecy. He expanded his trusts. He tightened control of his accounts. He restricted access to his records. And then, in the middle of all this turmoil, Johnny Carson did something no one expected. He started giving his money away, quietly, massively, and almost entirely in secret. This is the pivot that changes everything. For decades, fans had no idea that Carson was one of the largest anonymous philanthropists in American history. According to Foundation insiders and later discovered court records, Carson created the John W. Carson Foundation, a charitable trust that eventually became the main vessel for his fortune. This foundation donated tens of millions to children's hospitals, environmental research education programs, public broadcasting, medical institutions, ocean conservation arts foundations. But here's the part few people realize. Carson demanded that the vast majority of these donations be anonymous during his lifetime. One foundation staff member later said, "Johnny didn't want applause anymore. He got enough of that on TV. He wanted to help quietly." The scale of his giving only became clear after his death. In 2008, 3 years after Carson passed away, a required public filing revealed something astonishing. Over $156 million had been transferred from Carson's trust into the foundation. That was just the portion that had to be reported. Insiders believe the true total exceeded $200 million. This single event, this massive transfer, is the central reason people think Carson's fortune vanished. It didn't vanish. It moved, quietly, deliberately, precisely as Carson designed it. The rest of his wealth? It remained protected inside layers of trusts, inaccessible to the public and shielded by some of the strictest confidentiality clauses in estate law. And it all ties back to Carson's core belief. His money should serve purpose, not publicity. But there is still one more layer to this story. One final twist that reveals why Johnny Carson protected his estate as fiercely as he did. It involves the one thing he valued more than his money: control. Johnny Carson's final years were peaceful, quiet, and far removed from the spotlight that had defined his earlier life. But the emotional foundation for his extreme privacy had been building for decades. According to one of Carson's closest personal friends, Johnny never believed fame was healthy. He didn't want the public to pick apart his children, his relationships, or his money. He had spent half a century being watched, judged, discussed, analyzed, and he hated it. To Carson, privacy wasn't simply a preference. It was a necessity for emotional survival. He once told a colleague, "When I walk off that stage, I want to disappear." So he did. He retreated to Malibu. He sailed. He read. He kept only a small circle of friends. He rarely granted interviews. He lived quietly with his fourth wife, Alexis. And as he embraced this private life, he made one final decision. He would ensure that his financial legacy remained private too. This is why Carson employed multiple irrevocable trusts, charitable remainder trusts, family annuity vehicles, layered legal entities that bypass probate. All of these tools meant the same thing: his money would never become public information. One estate planner familiar with the structure later said, "It is airtight, one of the most private estates I have ever seen." This is why, even today, you cannot simply look up what happened to Carson's fortune. It was designed to be invisible, but invisibility doesn't mean absence. Someone received that money, many someones. And in 2005, after Carson passed away, the largest single transfer of his wealth was executed. A transfer so massive, it stunned even seasoned philanthropists. But to understand the impact of this transfer, we have to examine the final and most revealing part of the story. Here is the truth. The truth Carson never wanted celebrated, never wanted dissected, and never wanted publicized. Johnny Carson gave most of his fortune to charity, quietly, anonymously, deliberately. When the John W. Carson Foundation made its mandatory filings in 2008, the number that became public was staggering: $156 million transferred in a single event from his trust into the foundation. That wasn't the complete amount. It was simply the portion required to be disclosed under California law. Insiders estimate that the true total, including pre-death transfers and undisclosed charitable vehicles, may have exceeded $200 million. This means over 2/3 of Carson's net worth went to charity. The rest was divided into private trusts, family annuities, and protected accounts. Very little passed through traditional inheritance channels. His sons received carefully structured support, not giant lump sums. His wife received security but not ostentatious wealth. His legal and philanthropic teams oversaw the rest. One foundation board member put it simply: Johnny believed the money could do more good after he was gone than sitting in a bank. And this is the center of the mystery. Carson didn't leave behind a missing fortune. He left behind a hidden one. Hidden because he wanted it that way. He believed his legacy wasn't the laughter he created, or the ratings he dominated, or even the wealth he accumulated. His legacy, in his mind, was the good he could quietly do with that wealth. And that is exactly what he arranged. Johnny Carson was a man of contradictions. Publicly, he was warm, charming, and effortlessly funny. Privately, he was shy, guarded, and often lonely. On stage, he seemed like the most confident man in America. Off stage, he was haunted by the idea that everything could vanish. His money was no different. The $300 million fortune that fans once imagined sitting in vaults or family estates was never meant for display. Carson wasn't looking to leave behind monuments or boastful legacies. He wanted privacy. He wanted control. And ultimately, he wanted purpose. His fortune didn't disappear. It was transformed into millions of dollars for children's hospitals, into programs that help low-income students, into environmental research, into medical advances, into causes he believed in deeply, and he never asked for credit. In the end, Johnny Carson's greatest act wasn't a monologue or a character or a comedic moment. It was a silent one, a legacy built not on applause but on generosity, a legacy hidden behind the curtain, just the way he wanted it.